Two people enter the same work meeting. One feels energy, clarity, presence. The other feels fatigue, anxiety, a strange sensation of being disconnected from their own body. Both prepared the same material, slept the same 8 hours, drank the same coffee. But something invisible separates these experiences. One makes decisions that move her forward. The other makes decisions that keep her in the same place, month after month, year after year. People try, study, make efforts, but remain trapped in cycles they cannot break. What happens when intention cannot defeat automatic repetition? Subscribe to the channel to follow this investigation. Warning: this documentary uses AI-generated images for illustrative purposes. Although the visual is synthetic, the content is the fruit of rigorous research based on real scientific, psychological, and behavioral sources. Sources in the description. The woman wakes up at 5:30 in the morning. This has been going on for 3 years. She reads, meditates, exercises, takes vitamins. She knows all the concepts of productivity, neuroplasticity, emotional intelligence. In theory, she should be thriving. In practice, she remains tired. She remains anxious. She continues making the same decisions she criticizes in herself. She does not understand why knowledge does not translate into real change. The man has worked in technology for 15 years. He built a solid career, earns well, has stability. But every morning, upon waking, he feels a weight on his chest that he cannot explain. A sensation that something is blocked, locked, as if there were a part of him that never managed to express itself completely. He tries other areas, other projects, other relationships. The weight remains. These two cases illustrate something that appears frequently in behavioral observations. There exists a layer of human functioning that operates before conscious will, a layer where decisions are already being shaped, where emotional reactions are already being defined, where results are already being directed. It is here that dwells what we can call the invisible internal field. Pay attention to this. It is not spirituality. It is not metaphysics. It is applied neurophysiology. The human body functions as a complex bioelectric system. Every thought generates measurable electrical activity. Every emotion alters the internal chemistry and the energetic balance of the organism. The heart produces an electromagnetic field that is 50 times stronger than that of the brain. This field influences not only the body itself, but also the way the brain processes information and makes decisions. In many cases, people believe they decide rationally, that they weigh pros and cons, that they logically analyze situations. But research in neuroscience shows that brain activity related to a decision begins milliseconds before the person has awareness that they are deciding. What they experience as conscious choice is, in large part, the posterior interpretation of a process that was already underway. This does not mean we are robots. It means that there exists a layer of functioning that needs to be recognized and, in some cases, reorganized so that conscious decisions have real space for action. Try to follow this sequence. You wake up with a sensation of tension in the body. This tension did not arise in that moment. It comes from a sustained internal state often related to chronic stress, unresolved expectations, or emotional patterns that have repeated for years. This state of tension alters your perception. When you look at the day that is starting, you do not see the same possibilities you would see if you were in an internal state of calm and presence. Your attention fragments. Your priorities become confused. The decisions you make throughout the day are influenced by this initial state, even if you do not perceive the connection. At the end of the day, the results of these decisions reinforce the sensation that something is not working. And this feeds the same internal state that caused the initial tension. The cycle closes and repeats the next day. This is not an individual phenomenon. It is a pattern that appears on a large scale in modern societies. People functioning in constant alert with the nervous system dysregulated, making decisions to relieve tension instead of building a future. Look at what happens next. When the nervous system is in a state of chronic alert, the brain prioritizes immediate survival over long-term planning. The person makes impulsive decisions, seeks instant gratification, avoids risks that could be beneficial, or paralyzes in the face of changes that could improve their life. It is not a lack of character. It is a system operating in emergency mode. The central question is not to moralize these patterns. It is to recognize that they are learned, automatic, and reversible. But for this, it is necessary to understand that there is a fundamental difference between acting from a coherent internal state and acting from a fragmented internal state. When we observe people who manage to maintain clarity in situations of pressure, who make strategic decisions consistently, who seem to have access to sustained energy, we are not seeing moral or genetic superiority. We are seeing the result of an organized internal field, a state where the nervous system is not in conflict with itself, where attention can sustain itself on long-term objectives, where emotions inform rather than dominate. Notice how this repeats. The person who thrives is not necessarily more intelligent or more disciplined. They operate from an internal state that allows their intelligence and discipline to express themselves consistently. And here we arrive at the core of the issue. This internal state is not fixed. It can be cultivated, but this requires recognizing that the majority of conventional approaches to change, defining goals, creating habits, thinking positively, work only with the conscious layer of human functioning. They ignore the layer where decisions really begin to be shaped. Sometimes what seems like a lack of energy is, in truth, an immense amount of energy being wasted in invisible internal conflicts. The person fights against themselves all the time, between what they want to do and what they think they should do, between what they feel and what they believe they should feel, between who they are and who they believe they need to be accepted. This internal conflict is energetically expensive. It fragments attention, disperses vital force, and creates a state of constant tension that affects everything from sleep quality to the capacity to make clear decisions. When this conflict diminishes, when there is more internal alignment, the person experiences a sensation that energy was left over. Energy that was previously being used to maintain internal contradictions. Science calls this cardiac coherence when measured through heart rate variability. Ancient traditions called it prana, chi, presence. The terms change, but they point to the same phenomenon. An internal state where the body's systems operate in harmony, where mental activity is not in conflict with emotional response, where there is a sensation of integrity between intention and action. It is not always the world that blocks. Often it is the body itself trying to protect itself from changes that the conscious mind desires, but that the nervous system interprets as threats. That is why willpower alone rarely produces lasting changes. It works against the system, not with it. Try to follow this example. A person decides to change careers. Rationally, she knows the change is necessary. Emotionally, she feels enthusiasm for the new direction. But every time she takes concrete steps in the direction of the change, her body reacts with anxiety, insomnia, irritability. It is not conscious self-sabotage. It is the nervous system interpreting change as danger and activating protection responses. The person can force the change through pure discipline. Some succeed, but the energetic cost is high and, in many cases, she ends up abandoning the process or developing symptoms of stress that make the change unsustainable. The alternative is to work with the nervous system, not against it. This means creating internal conditions of safety so that the change can happen, without activating survival alarms. In part of the observed experiences, the people who achieve lasting changes are not those who have the most willpower. They are those who manage to create internal states that make the changes natural, almost inevitable. They do not fight against themselves. They reorganize themselves internally in a way that new choices emerge naturally. This does not happen overnight, and it does not happen only through the mind. It involves the body, the nervous system, emotional patterns, quality of attention. It involves recognizing that we are complex systems, not simple machines that respond only to rational commands. What many people call quantum energy, imprecisely but intuitively accurately, is this capacity of the human system to operate in states of greater or lesser internal coherence. When there is coherence, small actions generate amplified results. When there is fragmentation, great efforts generate little result. There are patterns that repeat. The person in a state of internal coherence makes decisions that align naturally with their long-term objectives. They do not need to force themselves to do what is good for them. They naturally feel attracted to choices that nourish and develop them. Not by external discipline, but by a kind of internal intelligence that emerges when the body's systems are not in conflict. The person in a state of internal fragmentation makes decisions that relieve momentary tension but create future problems. They eat when they are not hungry, procrastinate when they need to act, seek stimuli when they need rest, isolate themselves when they need connection. Not out of moral weakness, but because their system is operating in survival mode, prioritizing immediate relief over sustained well-being. Pay attention to this. The difference between these two states is not in what the person knows or in what they want. It is in the internal functioning that precedes their conscious choices. When we begin to observe these patterns, a question arises naturally. If our internal state influences our decisions and results so much, why did no one teach us to work consciously with it? Why do we learn to manage money, time, relationships, career, but we do not learn to manage internal states? In many cases, this happens because our culture privileges what is visible and measurable over what is subtle and subjective. It privileges action over internal state. It privileges external results over internal coherence. This is not a problem when the two paths align naturally. It becomes a problem when they enter into conflict, when the search for external results fragments the internal state, creating a cycle where the more the person strives, the more distant they become from what they really want. And here we arrive at a delicate question. Recognizing the importance of internal states does not mean ignoring external reality. It does not mean that positive thinking solves concrete problems or that good energy pays bills. It means understanding that our capacity to deal effectively with external reality depends, in large part, on the quality of our internal functioning. A person in a state of internal coherence does not live in fantasy. They see reality more clearly, make more effective decisions, sustain efforts for longer, recover more quickly from setbacks, and maintain long-term perspective even in situations of pressure. These are practical skills that impact concrete results. But to develop these skills, it is necessary first to recognize that they exist, and that they are not the privilege of a lucky few who were born that way. They are capacities that can be developed through the understanding of how our internal systems function, and through practices that promote coherence instead of fragmentation. The problem is that in many traditions that recognize this, the knowledge became mixed with mysticism, superstitions, and unreal promises. This created a reaction of skepticism that threw away valuable insights along with the exaggerations. The question is not to rescue ancient beliefs literally. It is to separate what in them points to real phenomena from the elements that are products of specific eras and cultures. Contemporary neuroscience offers a more precise language to understand many of the phenomena that ancient traditions observed intuitively. Conscious breathing affects the nervous system in measurable ways. Sustained attention alters brain structures. Positive emotional states influence immune function. Practices of presence modify activity in areas of the brain related to well-being. These are not placebo effects or suggestion. They are physiological changes that can be measured and replicated. What ancient traditions called the cultivation of vital energy, today we can understand as conscious regulation of the nervous system and optimization of internal states for effective functioning. But for this knowledge to translate into real change, it needs to leave the conceptual level and become embodied practice. And this brings us back to the central question: how to create internal conditions that make natural the choices that rationally we know are beneficial. The answer lies in the automatic mechanisms that regulate our daily experience, but that are rarely recognized consciously. A marketing executive discovered this by accident. For years, she woke up agitated, checked her cell phone immediately, drank strong coffee, and dove into work. Productive, but always tense. One day, an internet failure forced her to stay 15 minutes without digital stimuli in the morning. She just breathed and observed the sensations of the body. When the day started, there was something different. The meetings flowed better. The decisions came out with more clarity. The difference was so marked that she repeated the experience in the following days. What she discovered without knowing is that she had interrupted an automatic pattern of activation that kept her nervous system in a state of alert from the moment she woke up. Those 15 minutes allowed her body to recalibrate to a more coherent functioning. It was not formal meditation, it was recognition that there exists an internal rhythm that, when respected, improves the quality of everything that comes after. This brings us to the heart of the question. The patterns that control our daily experience operate through automatic cycles that were established over years, often decades. They are not the product of current conscious decisions. They are the result of adaptations that the nervous system made to deal with demands, stresses, and environments of the past. The problem arises when these patterns continue operating automatically, even when the original circumstances no longer exist. Try to follow this sequence. A child grows up in an environment where they need to be always alert to mood changes of the adults around them. Their nervous system learns to constantly monitor signs of social danger. This skill might even be useful in childhood. But when this same person reaches 30 years old, they continue spending energy monitoring the mood of colleagues, anticipating conflicts that may not exist, interpreting neutrality as rejection. It is not paranoia. It is a system operating with settings that were not updated. The interesting thing is that these settings do not exist only in the mind. They are embodied in the nervous system, in patterns of muscular tension, in the quality of breathing, in the way attention organizes itself. That is why lasting changes rarely happen only through thought. They need to include the body and its automatic patterns. Pay attention to this. When a person is in a state of chronic alert, their breathing tends to be shallow and rapid. This breathing signals to the brain that there is present danger, even if there is no real threat. The brain responds by maintaining the state of alert. The shallow breathing continues. The cycle perpetuates itself without conscious intervention. Breaking this cycle does not require willpower. It requires recognition that breathing is a bridge between the automatic and the conscious. When the person learns to breathe in a slower and deeper way, they are not just relaxing. They are sending direct signals to the nervous system that it is safe to exit the state of alert. With practice, this becomes automatic in the opposite direction. The system defaults to a state of calm instead of a state of tension. This is a small example, but it illustrates a larger principle. Sustained changes happen when we manage to work with the automatic systems instead of against them, and this is possible because these systems, although automatic, are adaptive. They respond to new information when this information is presented consistently and bodily, not just mentally. Look at what happens when a person learns to recognize the first signs of an automatic pattern activating itself. Perhaps it is a specific tension in the chest that always precedes episodes of anxiety, or a sensation of emptiness in the stomach that appears before impulsive decisions, or a subtle alteration in the quality of attention that indicates they are about to enter a state of mental dispersion. In many cases, the simple recognition of these signs already creates a small pause between the stimulus and the automatic response. And in this pause, there is space for choice. Not a heroic choice that requires immense effort, but a natural choice that emerges when there is awareness of what is happening internally. The issue is that these signs are subtle. They happen at the level of bodily sensations, of micro-emotions, of variations in the quality of presence. Our culture trains us to pay attention mainly to what is big, dramatic, urgent. We lose the sensitivity to detect the internal movements that precede major emotional events. It is like learning to drive. In the beginning, a person needs to think consciously about every movement. When to step on the clutch, how to make a turn, how much to accelerate. With practice, these movements become automatic. But if they want to improve their driving, they need to return to paying conscious attention to specific aspects of their technique. Consciousness does not replace the automatic, it refines the automatic. Likewise, working with internal states does not mean consciously controlling every emotional response or every mental process. It means developing sensitivity to recognize patterns while they are forming and creating conditions so that more effective patterns establish themselves naturally. Sometimes this is simpler than we imagine. and sometimes it is more complex than we would like it to be. It depends on how deep the patterns are that need to be revisited and how much time they had to establish themselves. It is not always possible to resolve in a few weeks patterns that formed over decades, but it is always possible to start working with them consciously. And small changes in fundamental patterns tend to have amplified effects in many areas of life. An example that appears frequently: people who learn to recognize when they are making decisions from an internal state of scarcity versus an internal state of abundance. Scarcity, in this context, does not necessarily refer to money. It refers to a state where there is a sensation that there is not enough time, enough energy, enough possibilities. In this state, decisions tend to be defensive, focused on avoiding losses rather than creating gains. Abundance, on the other hand, is an internal state where there is a sensation that there exists sufficient resources: time, energy, creativity, possibilities. In this state, decisions tend to be more generous, creative, focused on growth rather than protection. The interesting thing is that these two states can alternate in the same person on the same day, depending on factors like sleep quality, stress level, recent relational dynamics, or even natural hormonal rhythms. Recognizing which state you are in can inform when to make important decisions and when it is better to wait for a moment of greater clarity. This does not mean procrastinating indefinitely waiting for the perfect state. It means recognizing that there exist moments where our capacity to process information and evaluate consequences is naturally better, and moments where it is naturally compromised. Working with these rhythms instead of against them can significantly improve the quality of choices over time. Subscribe to the channel to continue following these invisible patterns that shape our daily experience. Another pattern that repeats: people discovering that what they interpreted as laziness was, in truth, an overloaded nervous system trying to protect itself through the reduction of activity. When there is excessive demand for prolonged periods, whether external or self-imposed, the system can respond by diminishing motivation for actions that require energy. It is not a moral failure, it is automatic regulation. Recognizing this changes the approach. Instead of forcing more activity, the person can focus on reducing the overload and restoring the natural capacity for action. Instead of fighting against laziness, she can ask, what needs of the system are being ignored? What demands can be adjusted? How to create conditions so that natural motivation returns? Frequently, this involves revisiting the relationship with rest. Our culture tends to see rest as absence of productivity, as lost time that needs to be justified. But complex systems, and we are complex systems, need periods of low activity to process information, consolidate learnings, and restore energetic resources. When rest is treated as guilt instead of biological necessity, the person may be physically still but mentally agitated. This does not restore the system. It can even increase the overload because it adds internal conflict to the equation. The body trying to rest and the mind criticizing the body for resting. Effective rest happens when there is internal alignment regarding its necessity and value, when the person can be still without fighting against the stillness. This allows the internal systems to truly restore themselves, which naturally leads to the return of motivation and energy for action. There are patterns that repeat. People who fight against the need for rest end up in cycles where they need more and more stimulus to feel motivated. People who respect the natural rhythms of activity and rest maintain more stable levels of energy and motivation over time. But here we arrive at a delicate question. Recognizing the importance of rest and internal rhythms does not mean using this as justification to avoid responsibilities or necessary challenges. There exists a difference between respecting real needs of the system and using self-care concepts to avoid growth. The difference lies in the quality of attention. When someone is genuinely overloaded, there are specific bodily signs: fatigue that does not improve with sleep, frequent irritability, difficulty concentrating, loss of interest in activities that are normally pleasurable. When someone is using self-care to avoid challenges, frequently there are different signs: restlessness, a sensation of wasting time, self-criticism that increases rather than decreases with rest. Learning to distinguish these states requires development of internal sensitivity. And this sensitivity is not something one learns once and then has forever. It needs to be cultivated continuously because internal signs are subtle and can change as we change. In many cases, people who develop this sensitivity report a sensation that they are learning to converse with their own system. Not in the sense of hearing voices, but in the sense of recognizing that there exists an intelligence in the body that can inform decisions when we learn to pay attention to its signals. This bodily intelligence is not mystical. It is the result of millions of years of evolution that created sophisticated systems of internal monitoring and adaptive response. The problem is that our modern life frequently disconnects us from these systems, teaching us to superimpose mental commands over bodily signals. Reconnecting with this intelligence does not mean abandoning rational thought. It means integrating rational information with intuitive information, creating a more complete decision-making system. When mind and body are aligned in one direction, actions tend to be more effective and sustainable. When they are in conflict, even well-planned actions can be sabotaged by internal resistances that were not considered. And here we arrive at an important observation. Changes that involve only the mind tend to be fragile. Changes that involve only the body tend to be limited. Changes that include mind and body in an integrated way tend to be deeper and more lasting. This does not happen automatically. It requires specific practice. It requires learning to pay attention to levels of experience that we normally ignore. It requires patience with a process that can be slow and non-linear. But when it happens, there is a different quality in the experience of life. Not necessarily easier, but more integrated. Not necessarily without challenges, but with more internal resources to deal with challenges. Not necessarily without uncertainty, but with more capacity to tolerate uncertainty without entering into panic. Perhaps the most important insight is this: we are not trying to create a perfect internal state that never changes. We are learning to work with the natural dynamic of expansion and contraction, activation and rest, certainty and uncertainty that characterizes all living systems. When we learn to surf these internal waves instead of fighting against them, our experience of life changes fundamentally, even if external circumstances remain the same. And this capacity to surf the internal waves, once developed, becomes a resource we can access in any situation. It does not depend on perfect external conditions. It does not depend on other people behaving in a certain way. It depends only on our capacity to work consciously with the systems that have always been operating within us, but that rarely receive the attention they deserve. The question that remains is, to what extent are we willing to develop this capacity? To what extent are we willing to treat our internal states with the same seriousness that we treat our career, our finances, our external relationships?